This lecture will touch upon the introduction to the book of Corinthians. When missionaries go from one land to another, they often face more than just language barriers and geographical territories as they seek to share the gospel. They may confront cultural issues such as mores, shame and honor issues, views of time differences, individualism and collectivism, relationship rules, differences in how people see right and wrong, as well as race and ethnicity issues. When Corinth came into Paul's view, this marvelous city would take Paul years to accomplish his missionary activity. This city was one of commerce, culture, politics, philosophy, society, and even sin. Corinth has a population of almost 7 million. It's estimated there were about 500,000 slaves and 200,000 freemen. And they practiced almost anything and everything and lived about the same kind of lifestyles. Now, part of what we want to do is to remind ourselves that Paul's on the second missionary journey. And the Apostle Paul has started from Antioch of Syria. He will make his way on over to Derbe and Lystra. And remember that as he started out, Barnabas and Paul disagreed about John Mark, and Barnabas went another direction. And Paul takes Silas. And when he gets to Lystra, he picks up young Timothy. And they make their way on over to Troas. And it's here that he has his Macedonian vision of a man that needs help. So the Apostle Paul crosses the Dardanelles Straits, goes to Neapolis, on over to Philippi. While he's in Philippi, of course, we know the story, how he's arrested, put into jail, he's been flogged. And when they learn about this, his Roman citizenship, they set him free. But before they do, there was a revival, and the Philippian jailer and his family were saved. He then goes on over to Thessalonica, and here we know he's here at least 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer. But the Jews run him out of town, and so he travels on down to a place called Berea. And the Bereans, we're told, were a noble people. They studied the word, and as they study the word, some of the Jews from Thessalonica came down. They stirred up a crowd of Gentiles, and the Apostle Paul had to leave, leaving Silas and Timothy behind, and he goes on to Athens. And while he's here, he's quite concerned about the people at Thessalonica, and before he's able to really do much of anything, he sends Timothy arrives. He sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to see about the people. He then goes on down to Corinth, and here he begins to work with Apollos and Aquila, and to share the gospel. And so this is how the Apostle Paul makes his way to Corinth on his second missionary journey. You can read about that in Acts 17. Now, Corinth's location, it's situated on the southwestern corner of a 10-mile isthmus connecting the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the Greek mainland. A northwest to southwest road connected the city with its western port city, Lycaon, and its eastern one in Centuria. Now, this kind of gives you a map of where Athens is located, and Corinth, and then, of course, in Achaia here. You see the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Corinth was situated on a broad plain at the base of the Acrocorinth, which reaches about 1,886 feet. And the city was built on the upper terraces and open toward the sea and Lycaon. And here's a picture of that upper Acropolis. Corinth's climate is normally pleasant with blowing breezes from the sea, very comfortable, and invited many people from around the Greco-Roman world to settle. Corinth's importance began when it was the political capital and Roman colony in 27 BC. It became a melting pot for many races of people and their religions. Now, the social life, Corinth was really the example of most of the Greco-Roman social life. Its prosperity developed a social stratification that was almost impossible to break out of one's current position. The middle class was almost non-existent in Corinth. The wealthiest level were aristocrats, followed by plutocrats. The aristocracy were the ones involved in politics and usually lived by more Roman influence than Greek. The largest class were those of working people. Their life was one of struggle and hard work. This provided the necessities of life, and many were involved in agriculture. And we know that farming was good in Corinth, and you can see 1 Corinthians 9, 7 through 11, where the Apostle Paul makes reference to that. Below common workers were the rabble, known as thieves, and these were followed by slaves who had no legal standing. Now, the games, all the population enjoyed the Isthmian Games and other forms of entertainment. The Isthmian Games were second to the Olympic Games of popularity, and these were held every 2 years. Some of the typical games were foot races, wrestling, boxing, and chariot races. And here you see some jumping weights from the 6th century BC. This is a helmet. Now, wouldn't you like to have somebody's sword just bang you across the top of that? This is a Olympic champion, and the way we know that is you'll notice that he has a wreath over his head, and this is probably celery, and either celery was one of the things that were normally given as a crown, and others sometimes were laurels. Now imagine a man working for a whole year or maybe 2 years to prepare for the Olympics, and this is what he's going to win. I mean, it's a wreath that's going to perish, and Paul makes mention of that. And yet we have a crown that will last for all eternity, and so quite common. Some cultural arts. Athens overshadowed Corinth in this area, but they had their own cultural arts. They had outdoor theaters that could seat 20,000 people. The people of Corinth there were some with influence. These are mentioned by Paul. For example, Gaius hosted the church in his house, 1 Corinthians 1:14, Romans 16:23. There was also Chloe's people, 1 Corinthians 1:11. Crispus, the archisynagogue, whom Paul baptized. Some of the religions in Corinth, there were numerous temples found in Corinth dedicated to the pagan gods of the Greco-Roman world. There were Eastern and Egyptian gods and goddesses found in Corinth as well. The immoral climate was due to the great number of religions found in Corinth. The moral climate was ripe for immorality. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, had a temple here. At one time, there were over 1,000 temple prostitutes serving in the temple. Now, her temple is located on the top of the Acropolis to remind citizens of her importance to them. Now, during Paul's time, we're not for sure there were that many temple prostitutes that were serving, but again, the immorality was rampant in the city of Corinth. The result of religious freedom allowed Paul to enter the city with his gospel. It was also a cosmopolitan place, a world place. That's what cosmo means. And poly comes from polis, a world city. It's materially corrupt, intellectually alert, and had a pronounced tendency to let its citizens indulge their every desire and whim without challenge or question. And when you think about Paul in the church, we want to see how they come together. We know he had begun his missionary work in Athens. His encounter there seemed to have left a bitter taste in his mouth. He traveled about 50 miles west and entered Corinth with a very simple message: Christ crucified. In Acts 18, it relates that Paul entered Corinth and stayed with a husband and wife team, Aquila and Priscilla. They were apparently tent makers, as Paul was. And in that time, if you were a tent maker, all the tent makers were located in one section of the city. Pottery makers were at another place, and so forth. So this is how they would have met. Early days in Corinth, Paul reasoned with the Jews in the synagogues on the Sabbath. He's rejected by the synagogue and turned to the Gentiles by entering the house of Titus Justus, who lived next door to the synagogue, as found in Acts 18, 6 through 7. Titus Justus' house became Paul's operating center for the next 18 months. Yeah, he stays here for a year and a half. And probably 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are written from this long stay in Corinth. I mentioned earlier that it may have been from Athens, so there's some discussion on that. The people in the church were of social diversity. Membership ranged from the common working people like Aquila and Priscilla to the more powerful Crispus. One other influential man would be Erastus, the owner of a house. Again, others included Titus Justus, who was a God-fearing proselyte, Paul's host Gaius, So you have a mix of philosophical, social, and religious ideas. So imagine having some of the society's upper crust, some of the lower crust, and when you get to 1 Corinthians 11, where they're having the Lord's Supper, those who are the haves are taking advantage of the have-nots, eating all the food, drinking all the wine, and those who are the slaves come in late and they are left out. Now the church again was in many ways immature. In many ways it's gifted. 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 goes over these gifts. And again, members will need to learn to spiritual giftedness doesn't automatically equal spiritual maturity. And what a problem this church had. Paul's charge before the Roman governor, Gallio, in AD 51 to 53 helps place him here in a chronology of his life. Roman proconsuls took office in July 1, so Gallio took over sometime in the summer. We don't have reference to Gallio in the early part of Paul's work here, but he probably came after Paul arrived. Paul's arrival in Corinth was near the fall of AD 50, a period of about 9 months before the proconsul took office July 1st, AD 51. Paul left Corinth a few days after the charges were dropped, according to Acts 18:18. Returned once more while on his third journey. He arrived from Ephesus and stayed a mere 3 months. Paul's correspondence provided more involved relationship between the church and Paul. He had left Corinth and wrote them a letter warning them not to associate with an immoral member of the church, according to 1 Corinthians 5:19. Later news arrived that there were divisions within the body of the church. This information came from Chloe's people and by Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, who visited Paul from Corinth. And you find them mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:11 and 1 Corinthians 16:17. A letter was sent to Paul as well with a request that he address certain issues in 1 Corinthians 7:1. To answer their questions and to deal with these issues, he writes 1 Corinthians. Paul sent Timothy to Corinth while he waited until he could make a visit. The reception of 1 Corinthians seems to have made some significant changes in the life of the church. Many began to grow spiritually. The letter seems to have done its job, and that can be seen in that 2 Corinthians does not mention anything about the Lord's Supper or litigation between the members as seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Now, it was not totally effective as seen by the gradual deterioration of the fellowship. Problems continued to mount. Paul felt he would make a second visit, that's in 2 Corinthians 12:14 and 13:1, and shows that a third visit was made. This exchange brought sorrow, according to 2 Corinthians 2:1. The quick trip interrupted Paul's 3-year work in Ephesus. Now he left Ephesus, went to Corinth, and then returned to Ephesus. After leaving them the second time, Paul wrote them a letter composed of many tears, according to 2 Corinthians 2:4. And that caused them sorrow that we read about in 7:8. Titus took this letter to them and continued to organize the effort to gather love offering for the church in Jerusalem, according to 2 Corinthians 8. The last contact between Paul and his work at Ephesus was during this sorrowful letter. Paul left Ephesus after the riot led by Demetrius and traveled through the province of Asia and onto the province of Macedonia. In Macedonia, he receives good news. The Corinthians had received the letter in a positive fashion. That's recorded in 2 Corinthians 7:5 through 16. And he writes 2 Corinthians pleased with the news, and he had heard of some other problems in the church. So after working among the churches at Macedonia for some time, he makes his third visit to Corinth. He would be here about 3 months, and there was a renewed relationship between Paul and these Corinthians that had been strange for a while. While in Corinth, he stays with Gaius and writes his theological masterpiece, Romans. So in conclusion, with the possible exception of Ephesus, no other church occupies as much of Paul's time and attention as Corinth. Due to its unique situation, culture, political life, religious diversity, this church faced things other churches did not. This Corinthian congregation gives us the best arena to see Paul handling practical problems within the fellowship. He applies practical principles to specific situations, and Corinth may have become everyone's city. Now, a summary of the relationship again. First of all, he evangelizes Corinth during the secondary journey. Secondly, he writes his first letter that's now lost and mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:9 through 11. While at Ephesus, he writes 1 Corinthians on his third journey, and there's some of those problems that are mentioned, divisions in the church, and then he goes on to answer other issues from the letter beginning in chapter 7. Number 4, there's painful visit to Corinth from Ephesus, and that failed. He writes a third letter that's now lost. 2 Corinthians 2, 4 through 11 mentions it. Sometimes it's called the severe letter, and Titus carried it. Number 6, he left Ephesus, goes to Macedonia, and he waits on Titus. He then meets Titus in Macedonia with a Corinthian report. Excited about that, he writes 2 Corinthians from Macedonia, carried back by Titus. And then he makes his third visit to Corinth. I pray that this has been a blessing to you. Feel free to review it as much as you would like. God bless you.